Welcome, everybody. Um, Welcome to today's webinar. We're thrilled to have you here with us. My name is Liz Syka, and I'll be your host for today's session. We have an exciting topic for you and an expert speaker lined up. Today's session is titled Common Ways Hackers Break In Vulnerabilities You Need to Fix. And we're super fortunate to have Nick Hours, our red team manager here at Sidara. Nick brings a strong background in IT along with his mad cybersecurity skills. Here's how today's session will unfold. Nick will present for about 20 minutes, followed by a live Q&A session where you can ask questions directly. We encourage you to participate throughout the session and don't hesitate to share your thoughts via the chat or the Q&A panel. As for housekeeping, just a quick few notes before we begin. The session will be recorded and we'll share the recording with you afterwards. If you have any technical issues, message us in the chat. As mentioned, we'll have Q&A at the end, so submit your questions whenever you're ready. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Liz. Greatly appreciated. So welcome, everybody. Appreciate everybody's time here on the Friday almost afternoon. So yeah, as Liz alluded to, we're going to talk today about common ways hackers break in and vulnerabilities you need to fix. And when I say hackers, I really mean me and my team. But our job is to replicate hackers, so that kind of works out well. Or when I say replicate hackers, I should say malicious ones, threat actors, the ones we see in the real world. So just a couple quick stats. You know, we do what we do to protect organizations. Unfortunately, for organizations, cyber attacks have not slowed down at all. And most organizations have had to deal with them in some capacity, even in just the last year or two. And also, as you can see, they are certainly not cheap to deal with. So what are vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities are weak points in your environment that attackers can exploit. Now, I say environment and not systems specifically because not every vulnerability is necessarily a system. And I say that because your environment has users. And the first vulnerability we're going to talk about is exactly that. It's your users. So I'm not going to spend a ton of deep dive, or I shouldn't say, I'm not going to take a deep dive into the social engineering stuff too much this time. And I only say that because Courtney Bell, one of my colleagues here, did a fantastic presentation just last week on some non-traditional social engineering techniques that we do see in the real world. So what I'm going to talk about is really, again, I lead a red team, and we're replicating what we see in the real world in terms of threat actors who are trying to breach organizations. So in trying to replicate that, what are we doing in the red team? Well, we're trying to exploit humans. Generally, technical exploits are a more silent way to get into an organization, but they're much less common. People are usually pretty good about defending, the edges of the organization, the public-facing pieces. On the other hand, it's very difficult to account for every human choice that's made that really could have impact in your organization. And I say here it only takes one, because that's very true. It really does only take one human that makes an honest mistake most of the time to get a threat actor into the organization. So what are some common scenarios we see with this vulnerability? Credential harvesting is a big one. So on the right-hand side here, we could see an Office 365 page. Folks who have been managing IT environments for long enough may recognize this as a relatively outdated Office 365 page. I'll be honest, we use it with great success still, which kind of speaks to, an opportunity and awareness for your end users. Just that, again, this isn't a page Microsoft even uses anymore, right? So, what the point here is with a page like this for a threat actor is, credential harvesting. So that is getting a user to hopefully believe this is an actual page they should be logging into, usually via like some sort of email that has a link to this page, and tries to convince them, hey, go to this page, type in your username and your password, sign in, and you'll get your new document we need you to sign, or something like that. So what happens once somebody's username and password are compromised? Well, we'll go ahead and turn around right away and try it on your inboxes, VPNs, virtual desktops, virtual applications. Sometimes there'll be a whole bunch of applications that all can be accessed with a single set of credentials. So those are the things we try to do right away as soon as we get credentials. The other piece is malware. It's gotten more difficult to get malware through email security from our perspective and our opinion. But people still open it, and there are still creative ways it is making its way through, email security appliances and such. So the great news is that people are unpatchable vulnerabilities in your environment. There is no patch, but there is plenty of room for mitigation and risk mitigation. So we have a couple steps here you could take to kind of start rolling this sort of thing into an environment. Um, Basic, do you do any security awareness training, right? Is there any, be it little, big, fancy, or not fancy, is there any awareness training hosted by the organization for its end users? So to get a little more advanced, do you simulate phishing attacks on users to test the effectiveness of the training? It's great to have the training, but of course, without testing it, you don't know if it's working. So it's kind of like your fire suppression system in a building, right? It's great to have it there, but if you don't do fire drills, nobody's going to know if all the things that are supposed to work the right way. And then expert. So we're talking now, you're doing your awareness training for users. You've done some basic phishing simulation tests. Think of maybe even just a commercial product. I know I don't want to name too many, but Sophos has, I think, Fish Threat, and KnowBe4 is probably the most popular one I've seen in the market. But those are your basic phishing attacks in a box. You give you some room for customization. And then you'll have a good idea of, hey, are my users clicking? Are they not clicking? What are they doing? But that expert level, okay, what's the outcome of a phish? We have the credentials, and as I kind of mentioned prior, what happens with those credentials after they're breached? Are they valid on the VPN? Is there no two-factor? And now we could just get onto your network with those credentials. So that's kind of where you could finally start to say what we see happen here is you simultaneously test your people and your technical controls around phishing at the same time when we do this kind of expert level. So there's a lot of valid there, or I'm sorry, a lot of value there rather. And then other. So, I wanted to mention multi-factor is great. It's the standard at this point. If you don't have multi-factor or two-factor on your external facing assets or login pages, at a minimum, I would certainly be pushing towards doing something like that. I do want to mention the Duo push option. I'm certainly not here to say anything bad about Duo. It's a great product. But what I will say is, again, just speaking from experience, is that special little push feature that they have. If you're not familiar, somebody logs in, they're prompted with two-factor page. You could say, hey, give me a little push notification to my phone, and you get a little button on your phone, it pops up, you hit OK, and you've completed your two-factor. We've had great success with just sending, we get somebody's credentials, we log in, we get the two-factor page, we send the push, and people will just accept it anyways. So, it's actually a well-documented attack called push fatigue. Duo has a blog right on their page, or on their site, all about it. I don't want to say turn the push feature off, but if it's something that you're not going to turn off, certainly make it an emphasis in your awareness training. Hey, this is a thing. A bad actor could send you a malicious push. If you didn't send it yourself, don't accept it. So again, this is why I call them unpatchable vulnerabilities, because you could have all your staff up to date on all of these techniques and training, and then you hire 3 new people next week, and they are in kind of that gap between when you had your last awareness training and when your next one's scheduled. So it's a tough vulnerability to defend against, and so that is why, even though maybe people on the call were expecting, or I'm sorry, on the webinar here, were expecting me to come out with some new 0-day for vulnerability 1, it is very much your people a lot of the times. So that is the first one. Second one is a little more technical. It's still by far a 0-day or anything top secret. In fact, I think a lot of people in the industry have been hounding Microsoft to make some changes about the way that this setting is rolled out in a insecure default, and that is SMB signing enforcement. So, this we see more often affecting your LAN than your WAN side of your business. But it has been abused over the WAN. People have found ways to deliver an attack through email that then ultimately, if you open a malicious attachment, will abuse the lack of SMB signing enforcement. So, what are we doing here when we're abusing SMB signing or lack of SMB signing enforcement? We are essentially a node on a network. Picture this little red computer here in the logo, and we're the bad guy or bad girl, and we are essentially looking for one server and one client, or more servers and more clients, but at least one of each. And we would like to find a way to start intercepting their traffic. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that, and it's beyond the point of this vulnerability, right? There's a handful of different ways we could get to this adversary in the middle position where we could sniff traffic. But once we are, we could sniff the traffic, we could intercept it, we could drop it, we could relay it. And relaying it is really the concern for SMB signing enforcement. So if I find SMB traffic because I'm an adversary in the middle and I want to forward it along to a server, and that server doesn't have SMB signing enforcement enabled, the server won't know if I'm the client or the attacker. When you enable SMB signing enforcement, that kind of breaks the attacker's chain, and it allows for there to be a more secure communication between the client and the server. So why do we bring this up? I've seen so many different attacks, documented in cyber news as new attacks in the last couple of years. And a lot of times you peel away the layers and it's just a relay attack underneath. And a lot of times the remediation is the same. It's, make sure your SMB signing enforcement is enabled. Another reason I bring it up is because anytime, within our applicable pen tests, meaning, maybe there's pen tests that don't have the necessary components to be vulnerable, but anytime they pretty much are in play, we have like 95% of our pen tests easily where we're reporting this, not as a hypothetical attack, but with complete proof of concept that this is, abusable in an environment. And generally it comes with some of the things we see here in the bottom. What are some common scenarios? So if we're adversary in the middle and we catch a low privileged user traffic, we're going to gain probably at least read writes privileges that they have against any server where we relay to that SMB signing is not enforced. So at a minimum, you're looking at a malicious actor probably gaining some read write access to different file shares on the network. In a less ideal scenario for an organization, an attacker can get a local admin relay. Generally, a local admin, should only be a local admin on a single machine, but sometimes for a lot of various reasons, that's not the case. And if we can relay a local admin credential around, a lot of times we'll actually start to gain execute privileges against different assets where the signing enforcement is not enabled. So, we bring it up because it's super common. It's a default setting. And up until recently, which I'll bring up in a minute here, up until recently, it's been a default setting on everything besides your domain controllers. And again, it's just super prevalent. So thankfully, the fix for this is pretty straightforward. Again, I mentioned it was a default setting in Windows other than domain controllers. Thankfully, Windows has, I should say Microsoft has started changing this, starting with preview builds of Windows 11 and Server 2025. Starting with these versions, they are going to make sure SMB signing enforcement is enabled by default. You'll have to go out of your way to turn it off and make your environment less secure. And we love to see that. We do love to see that. It seems like something that's easy. They could have done a long time ago. But again, a lot of organizations aren't going to move to the brand new operating systems, usually for a couple of years, just to let kind of the kinks of the new OS work out. Budget, has to get in play for the new operating systems or the new machines that support the new operating systems. So, Windows 11 rolled out relatively recently in terms of operating systems. And so we don't anticipate this is going to be in a lot of organizations for a while still. And so we still have these next few years, if not longer, where a lot of companies or organizations are probably running machines that do not have SMB signing enforcement enabled. So if you are not on the new OS, what do? Microsoft recognizes how many attacks have been developed that abuse this lack of SMB signing enforcement. And so they've honestly several pretty good documents on the Google machine for you just go on Google, you could say SMB signing enforcement remediation, and you'll find plenty. But what pretty much it comes down to is if you are an Active Directory shop, you could get on your group policies and push a group policy that essentially enables this setting. So it's nice when you could push something from group policy. You don't have to go around chasing a bunch of machines or manually updating anything. Um, I have to, because of my IT experience, say, don't go pushing group policies to everything without testing them a little bit, of course, because rolling back is easier if something does happen to blow up. And vulnerability 3. This is going to be the final vulnerability we talk about today. And again, I'm sorry if you're expecting 0 days and all of that stuff, but when we talk about what we're really seeing affect the majority of organizations, it's the two things we just talked about and anything password-ish. And what does that mean? So about a year or two ago, I did a different presentation. Part of that presentation, I went in preparation for part of that presentation, I went back through 3 or 4 years of pen test reports and collected all sorts of data in terms of what findings we had, how common they were, what kind of classification they fit into. And almost 50% of findings over 3 or 4 years had something to do with passwords, everybody's favorite. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody picked a bad password and that's 50% of the findings. It was passwords as a general kind of topic, right? So this is another one that stems from human behavior, so it makes it difficult to patch. I'm sorry about that. Make sure I'm on the right thing here. There we go. So, most of these stem from human behavior. And these are things like default password, right? You put some new hardware, software in the environment, and we're ready to just get you to use it. It's a new printer, it's new security cameras. We just want to roll it out into production and get using it. It may have default credentials related to it. And depending on what that system is, it may have more or less criticality. But it is something that we come across a ton. Most commonly printers, less commonly, but still we see it. Somebody's SolarWinds instance, an ILO or an IPMI interface for managing kind of the hardware end of your servers, switches, access points, a lot of IoT-ish stuff, right? So that's kind of under that general subject of passwords, is the use of default passwords or default credentials. Password stored in clear text. Somebody has, I'll use marketing for an example, and I'm sorry if there's any marketing people, Liz, sorry. But let's just say there's some marketing person and they've left the Facebook and social media and all these different platforms that all do not have a single sign-on because they're all kind of separate systems. Let's say somebody's even following the best practice of not reusing the same username and password on all these different sites, but then they just put them all in like a text file or something on their machine, or even worse, on like a network share where other people have access. We come across that quite a bit, maybe not specifically marketing. Again, I was just using an example, but where just a plethora of passwords are all in a single file, just ready to be used. So that is, again, it's not necessarily somebody picking a bad password, but it is poor practice in terms of storing the password. And the same thing, honestly, does apply to not just files, it applies to databases too. I don't want to go down too far of a rabbit hole there, but even if you're storing data in SQL and their passwords, or, they should still be encrypted in that database. And then crackable passwords. So this really does come down to the concept of somebody just picking a bad password. Maybe it's stored properly. Maybe it's stored with encryption or hashing so that it isn't so easily used if it's found in storage. But some variables here, but for the most part, if it's a bad password, it could still be cracked anyways. So kind of these three, I guess, offending password related vulnerabilities are extremely common. But again, there's some things that could be done about this. What might those things be? So for default passwords, that's probably the easiest one if you're in the IT position or decision making for IT position, because most products have their defaults or their security best practices well documented in the like user guide or deployment guide that comes along with it. So making sure you're changing any of those defaults to secure alternatives, whether it's the password, whether it's something uses a clear text protocol like HTTP instead of HTTPS, you know, just looking through any of those insecure defaults and changing them when possible. Furthermore, you know, unfortunately, what we see is more times than not, IT people are pretty good at not deploying stuff with the default insecure settings, where we come into these conversations all the time in a pen test. Here's all your insecure default passwords. And they say, oh, you know, half of these are from the print vendor or the security vendor or some other vendor that came and deployed these assets in the environment. That is easily, you know, something that could be addressed with a policy. And that way, when you start to do business with a print vendor, for example, and they come in and they want to do a deployment, you could say, here's our policy on deploying, you know, and then they could be, you know, basically held to a standard that says you're not going to put a bunch of security cameras or printers on our network where anybody with Google could basically figure out how to log into them. Clear text storage of passwords. Again, you know, for the most part, we find IT departments and IT staff are usually pretty good about this. That being said, doesn't mean we haven't ever found it in an IT, you know, person's home folder on their network share or anything like that. But there's a couple things you could do if, again, you know, especially on the IT side of things, where if you have access to just your Windows File Explorer, right? You can go to your network share and you could literally just use the search bar to search for any files that are named password or credentials or secret or something like that. And maybe you'll just be able to manually find a bunch of files in your network that would be considered offending files. Sometimes people are like, oh, I'm not going to name that suspicious file password.txt because I know somebody will find that. And so we'll be a little more obscure and we'll name it like grocery list.txt or something. You could, again, from an IT admin position, you could search for at least flat files, like the contents of those flat files. You could get into your PowerShell and there's a handful of commands here. These are, again, well documented. You could search these on Google, but these are fine string commands that are basically going to print the contents of whatever file you specify at the end of the command, and it's going to search for the word you specify in the middle. So, you know, the top one, for example, is saying find the word password in any text file. The one below that, pretty similar concept, just any file. Now, if there's files that can't be printed out, that's why I specify flat files. Like there's certain files that you can't print the contents out in PowerShell. You're not going to be able to search those this way. But just using these two techniques of searching by file name and searching flat files for content, you'll probably end up finding, especially in a good sized organization, you'll probably be surprised how many of these are sitting around in your environment. And then crackable passwords, you know, this is kind of the final piece. It's tough to force people to have strong passwords. To some extent, you can do it with a password policy and something like Active Directory. But you have to factor in the usability of the password. Everybody wants to talk about password managers, which are great, but it's difficult to use a password manager to get past your Windows login screen. So there's, you know, all these kind of factors into how do you force somebody to have a strong but usable password. We don't want people writing the password down and sticking it on their monitor by any means either. But choosing, you know, a complex enough password that's appropriate for the level of access gained if that password were to be compromised. So if you have a super low priv user, I'm not saying don't give them a good password, but they don't need the same password complexity as your domain administrator. It's basically what I'm saying there. You know, we've seen 14 character passwords that were basically 2 words with a number at the end, and we cracked them. So it's not necessarily a thing about length. It's definitely complexity. That's really more of the factor. In terms of cracking the password based on the password itself. Some other things that help make cracking the password more difficult for like me and my team is what the hashing or encryption mechanism is. So for example, if we talk about Kerberos, another Active Directory authentication suite, I guess you could say. You know, I think by default, it kind of rolls out with RC4 encryption, which is, you know, really well known to be a weaker encryption. So it supports you increasing its encryption strength by putting AES in place. And this is just one example, you know, Linux and web servers and SQL and all these different operating systems and applications that support the storage of or encryption and storage of sensitive data or passwords, things like that, usually have the support to increase the security of the encryption. And it's almost always suggested you're not usually going to take any sort of production hit. It's not going to slow anything down. I mean, modern computing is pretty quick. You're not going to usually hurt anything by going with a more difficult to crack encryption. And then, lastly, password age, right? So if we make it take longer for me to crack the password because I am fighting a more difficult hashing or encryption algorithm, so it's already slowing me down for that. It's a really difficult password, that's slowing me down. So you have all these things that slow me down. And then if you have the password age, couple months, and it's a really difficult to crack password, let's say I crack it in month 4, but in month 3 you change passwords, that's just another kind of piece of the sliding scale here. A difficult password, it rotates semi-regularly, how much of what strength encryption is being used. So these are all kind of things to consider when you can't choose your user's password for them, but when trying to put some controls around the ability for a password to be cracked. That is all items that you'd want to think through. So a couple key takeaways here. Some of these things are items I already touched on. We talked about multi-factor. I mean, just because I beat up on the Duo push feature a little bit doesn't mean I don't thoroughly encourage that multi-factor be used. Awareness training, we talked about that a little bit. This whole thing kind of falls under the concept of pen testing. Vulnerability scan kind of gets into that offensive security suite as well. Obviously, again, being the red team manager here, I highly suggest any sort of offensive security testing in your environment. Continuous network monitoring is important. Availability, right, is part of, sure, yeah, you could network monitor for malicious things, but if you look at cybersecurity and how it's kind of propped up on the CIA triangle, right, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Availability is a big piece. So when you talk about continuous network monitoring, yeah, malicious things are great, but even just a machine that's acting like it's not doing well, maybe a RAID issue with your server, maybe some CPU is spiked because something is going awry. Those are all part of your availability. So whether it's for malicious activity or just uptime, network monitoring is critical. Escalation paths, communication. This is obviously knowing what to do once something happens. It's time is of the essence usually in a compromise. So not having to spend as much time figuring out who to call, so to speak, is ideal. Disaster and recovery planning, you should be doing backups and you should be testing those backups too. It would really be less than ideal if you were doing backups, something happened and then you went to restore them and they were corrupt and you didn't know until you went to restore them. So do test restores. Proactive patch management. Again, everybody's pretty good at doing the Windows stuff, right? If you have a Windows and Active Directory environment, maybe you're using WSUS or Windows Update Service basically to push all your Windows patches. Just don't forget about the things that are not Windows. Again, I'm not trying to beat up on SolarWinds, just the SolarWinds, if you have FTP application you use, any applications you use that are not Microsoft maintained, just make sure there's some sort of patching schedule on that, because they do get forgotten about pretty frequently, unfortunately. So again, just a couple more things, everybody in the room could do, whether you're an IT person or you're just the everybody. And I don't mean to say just the everybody, but I just mean the not IT people. So some of these are, again, related to social engineering. It is still a really, really prevalent attack surface in organizations. So get creative. Again, don't just be UPS delivering a malicious package that doesn't exist. Try to think of other ways you could trick your users, because that's what malicious threat actors are actually doing, which means training them on red flags, training them on what modern phishing looks like, knowing your environment's risks. Sometimes this is knowing you have outdated technology. Sometimes this is knowing you have somebody who has failed phishing training 4 years in a row. Just plan accordingly. Deploying assets with best practices, that kind of goes back to the use of default credentials or maybe some other default settings that are not secure, like the lack of SMB signing enforcement as well, actually. Center for Internet Security, or CIS, they do have a lot of really good hardening guidelines and just different baseline sheets that you can work through in your environment for all sorts of really common enterprise applications, be it just your Windows servers, or whether, those are obviously more operating systems or more of the applications like Exchange or SharePoint, things like that. Again, even IT folks don't hesitate to call cybersecurity specialists. I like to say this because I have the IT background. The entire IT career I had before cybersecurity, I would have considered to be relatively successful, but I did not have any special cybersecurity knowledge, right? If I had to make a firewall change, I could get my way through that, et cetera. Setting up maybe a um, content filter, right? That's definitely has a security-esque responsibility to it. But there's so many other things that an IT person has to do in a given day, whether it's setting up new user accounts, setting up some new application, troubleshooting, dealing with email, dealing with an outage, planning for upgrades. There's so many things IT people have to do. And cybersecurity has become such its own world of things to know and deal with that if an IT person is qualified and up to speed on all these things, great. But don't hesitate to call somebody who is if you're not. It's certainly a consultation type feel, not nobody's being judgmental about anybody's environment. And then the everybody, right? So if you're not an IT person, you don't have admin access to make some of these changes. You want to be proactive in security, but you have limited, or at least you feel like maybe you have limited power to do so. Well, again, you get to choose your own password. That could help your environment and your IT team greatly. Just having a great password. It doesn't have to be impossible to remember, but just think about, okay, an attacker is going to pretend to guess my password. What are they going to do? They're going to pretend to be me. So maybe they're going to guess my kids' names. Well, how do they know my kids' names? Well, are they on the internet? Are they publicly accessible information? Your birthdays, anything that's kind of your go-to password probably is not a great password. And then a random string of 12 plus characters is honestly generally suggested. And people don't like to hear that because, again, passwords can be a pain. But they're really the one main thing stopping. It's like the lock on your front door to your house, Even if you're not required to change your password, maybe you're going back to your organization, you're like, I haven't had to change my password in 2 years. Proactively change it. If you're not sure how to change your password, maybe IT can set you up with a password that'll require you to change it next time you log in. I don't advise having them set you a password and that continue to be your password, because then somebody else knows your password. And you usually do not want that. I say be a canary, not in the sense of, fly into the mine coal and don't come back out, don't execute malware and say, oh yeah, we got malware on the environment. Just really, fly into the cave and fly out and say what you see, right? So do you see something suspicious? Is there a weird file? Is there something that you've never noticed before here? And all of a sudden it just seems off, that is the sort of thing you want to report. And then again, I talked about this. Do not store your passwords in a clear plain text file. Really, you should avoid any sort of file unless it's a file that was designed to store your credentials. If you think of your LastPass databases or your KeePass databases, these are heavily encrypted database files and a proprietary, not to say there's not ways to crack those too, unfortunately, but it's just that extra layer of security you're putting over your passwords. Okay, so I will open it up to questions. I wish I could have honestly talked to you guys for 2 more hours, but we'll open it to questions with what I brought now.
I do have to say one thing, defending marketing people everywhere. Password managers are great.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We love to see them.
Right. All right. So we've got our first question. Comments about security awareness and training are spot on. Oh yeah, Bob and Frank are going to be hosting a webinar next week and discussing ways to improve awareness and training programs effectiveness. So a quick plug for that, if you haven't already, please sign up for next week's webinar, Creative Approaches to Keeping Cybersecurity Awareness Engaging, featuring our very own Frank Drigo and Bob Chaika.
Yeah, that'll be a good one too. I can't wait to see that one.
Right.
Definitely.
Do we have any other questions? I know we're at the top of the hour. Ooh. Okay. I have heard about people storing their passwords in a password protected Excel file. Is this an issue?
I wouldn't call it an issue, and I would certainly say it is obviously better than just putting it in the spreadsheet itself, without any password protection. There are tools that can help crack the password that is used to protect the spreadsheet file, or really any like Word document or any of the Microsoft files that support encryption. So yes, it is. I should say no, it's not an issue. Yes, it's a good idea as opposed to not doing it. But it comes back to make sure there's a really good password protecting that file.
Excellent. Anybody else? Ooh, okay. Best practices for storing passwords and scripts.
Yeah, that's a good one. So depends on the type of script. If it's like a PowerShell script, there may be ways to support that being encrypted in the script. But what I see happen even more commonly as a suggestion, especially in like a Linux environment, which may or may not be what you're asking about, but is storing the password as an environmental variable. I see that happen quite a bit in Linux, again, specifically in Linux environments. I'm not sure if that translates exactly to Windows, but then again, yes, your password is stored somewhere. But if it's an environmental variable only you can read, and you're worried about the script leaking the password, the script could get leaked and it'll just reference an environmental variable, but it won't actually have the password in the file that way. So I think that's probably the way to go.
Okay, last chance. Anybody else interested in submitting a quick question? All right. Well, thank you so much, Nick. This was an excellent presentation. Really appreciated it. And thank you for your time. Thank you for everybody who attended. And again, if you haven't already, please sign up for next week's webinar, Creative Approaches to Keeping Cybersecurity Awareness Engaging, featuring our Frank Dorico and Bob Chaika. So with that being said, have a wonderful evening, a wonderful day, guys, everybody.
All right, thank you. Bye,
Take
guys.
care. Bye-bye.